Most airplanes slowly evolved from the ones that came before them. The Boeing B-47 Stratojet didn't. It looked like it had arrived from the future by accident. In 1947, just 44 years after the Wright brothers first left the ground, the B-47 appeared with swept wings, 6 jet engines, bicycle landing gear, and performance so advanced that it terrified the very people flying it. And somehow, this dangerous Cold War bomber became the blueprint for almost every modern jet airliner you've ever boarded. But getting there? That story involved flapping wings, rocket-assisted takeoffs, downward firing ejection seats, and pilots looping 6-engine bombers while carrying nuclear weapons. And yes, the Air Force once seriously considered turning the B-47 into a giant remote-controlled flying atomic missile. Most stories have another side. This one's just a little stranger. I'm Bill, and this is Buffalo Air Park. Let's dive in. When most people picture Cold War bombers, they think of giant aircraft like the B-52. But before the B-52 became the symbol of strategic air command, there was the airplane that truly dragged the United States into the jet age, the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. And honestly, calling it important almost feels like an understatement, because if you strip away the military markings and look closely at the shape of the aircraft, something becomes obvious. Those swept wings, those engines hanging beneath them, that sleek fuselage. You're basically looking at the DNA of the modern airliner. The B-47 was the bridge between the propeller era and the jet age we still live in today. But in the late 1940s, nobody really knew if this radical new design would even work. The original bomber Boeing proposed back in 1943 looked far more conventional, essentially a straight-wing bomber with jet engines attached. The problem was drag, lots of drag. Then, after World War II, Boeing engineer George Schreiber began studying captured German aerodynamic research on swept wings. What he found completely changed the project. He reportedly sent a message back telling Boeing to stop the existing bomber design entirely, and they did. Redesigned around a 35-degree swept wing. That decision changed aviation history, but it also created a monster. The B-47's wings were incredibly thin and unbelievably flexible. During flight, the wingtips could flex as much as 17 feet. 17 feet! Imagine sitting next to the wing of a modern airliner and watching it bounce around like a fishing pole. One pilot named Al Devereaux later described holding the aircraft in a deep stall and watching the wings begin flapping like a seagull. Not exactly comforting words in a 6-engine nuclear bomber. And because the wings were so thin, they developed a terrifying problem at high speed called aileron reversal. Normally, when a pilot turns the control wheel, the aircraft rolls in that direction. But at high speed, the B-47's ailerons could actually twist the entire wing, meaning the aircraft could roll the opposite way. Imagine turning left, and the airplane deciding it would rather go right. The only real solution was slowing down and hoping you had enough altitude left to recover. And then there were the engines. Going from idle to full thrust could take nearly 20 seconds. That may not sound terrible sitting on your couch, but during takeoff or landing, 20 seconds can feel like forever, especially in an aircraft weighing over 200,000 pounds. To solve the problem, the Air Force essentially decided to strap rockets to the airplane. Literally. Early B-47s carried rocket-assisted takeoff bottles, RATO units, to help shove the aircraft into the sky. At first, some were mounted internally near the rear fuselage, which meant pilots were effectively sitting on top of live rockets and massive fuel tanks at the same time. Eventually, engineers switched to external horse-collar rocket packs that could be jettisoned after takeoff. And, if that wasn't dramatic enough, the engines also used water methanol injection for additional thrust. The result was giant clouds of thick black smoke pouring from the engines during takeoff. But the real danger started once the aircraft reached altitude. The B-47 cruised around 35,000 to 40,000 feet. Up there, pilots entered an aerodynamic zone known as Coffin Corner. And Coffin Corner is exactly as friendly as it sounds. The margin between flying too slow and stalling, and flying too fast and losing control, could shrink in only a few knots. A tiny error could be catastrophic. And because autopilot systems at the time were primitive, Pilots had to manually maintain that razor-thin margin for hours at a time. One crew even described the environmental system malfunctioning so badly that snow formed inside the cockpit. Imagine flying a nuclear bomber through an indoor blizzard. Then came the landing, and somehow, landing might have been the most dangerous part of all. The B-47 used unusual bicycle-style landing gear with wheels lined up along the fuselage instead of mounted under the wings like most aircraft. If pilots landed at the wrong angle, the aircraft could begin violently bouncing nose up and nose down in a motion called porpoising. And, once that started, recovery became nearly impossible. Some aircraft skidded onto a wingtip and cartwheeled into crashes. To make matters worse, because the engines responded so slowly, a missed approach could become deadly. If you suddenly needed power, it might not arrive in time. So the Air Force came up with a bizarre solution. They deployed a drag parachute before touchdown, not after, before. The parachute created drag, allowing the pilots to keep engine RPM higher during approach, so power would already be available if needed to abort the landing. It sounds insane today, but in the 1950s, this was normal B-47 procedure. Not surprisingly, the aircraft earned a dark reputation. The Stratojet became known by some crews as a crew killer. Roughly 10% of the fleet was eventually lost in accidents. Hundreds of crew members died. And then, the Air Force made things even crazier. As Soviet air defenses improved, high-altitude bombing missions suddenly looked suicidal. So Strategic Air Command, or SAC, decided the B-47 should fly low-level penetration missions instead. Very low. As in treetop level. And that led to one of the strangest maneuvers ever assigned to a heavy bomber. LABS bombing, Low Altitude Bombing System, also known as toss bombing. The idea was simple in theory and absolutely horrifying in practice. The B-47 would race towards the target at low altitude carrying a nuclear weapon. At the last second, the pilot would yank the aircraft upward into a steep climbing maneuver. The bomb would automatically release while the aircraft pointed skyward. Then, the bomber would roll over the top and dive away to escape the blast. Yes, they were effectively looping a 6-engine bomber carrying nukes. One pilot later described watching another B-47 perform the maneuver and noticing the fuselage visibly bending into a U-shape during the pull-up. Because the aircraft was never really designed for repeated high-G maneuvers, metal fatigue became a massive problem. Aircraft literally began tearing themselves apart. The stress fractures became so serious that the Air Force launched a huge reinforcement effort called Project Milk Bottle. Massive wing pins had to be installed to keep the aircraft structurally intact, which is not exactly the kind of sentence you want associated with your bomber fleet. But despite all this, the B-47 became one of the most important aircraft of the Cold War, especially the reconnaissance versions. Aircraft like the RB-47H flew highly classified electronic intelligence missions probing Soviet radar systems. These aircraft carried crews of electronic warfare officers known as Crows or Ravens, and honestly, their job sounds miserable. They sat inside cramped compartments in the lower fuselage for missions lasting 12 to 14 hours. Some ejection seats even fired downward through the belly of the aircraft, which worked fine, unless you happened to be flying low. Several reconnaissance versions were actually shot down during Cold War operations, and because the missions were top secret, crews loved messing with curious ground personnel. That strange black nose radomes on some RB-47s? Crews joked they were bumpers in case they accidentally hit the tanker during aerial refueling, and people believed them. Other antennas supposedly formed a magical system capable of making Soviet missiles turn around and shoot down their own aircraft. Military humor has apparently never changed. At one point, the Air Force even explored converting the B-47 into a giant, unmanned nuclear cruise missile under something called Project Brass Ring. The concept was so wildly impractical that it was canceled on April Fool's Day in 1953, which somehow feels appropriate. But despite the danger, despite the accidents, despite all the madness surrounding the aircraft, the B-47 worked. It became the aircraft that taught America how to build and fly large, swept-wing jet aircraft. Without it, planes like the Boeing 707 probably don't happen the same way. And without the 707, modern air travel looks very different. That sleek jetliner carrying people comfortably across the Atlantic today? Part of its story begins with terrified B-47 crews wrestling a wildly unstable bomber through Coffin Corner while rockets exploded behind them. And honestly, that might be one of the strangest sentences I've ever said. The B-47 Stratojet was dangerous, unforgiving, and decades ahead of its time, but it helped define the Cold War without ever dropping a nuclear weapon in combat. And in the process, it quietly became the ancestor of the modern jet age. And that wraps up another tale from aviation's stranger side. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.